Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Colin. Thank you all for coming today. When I saw Mark's email that said that the title would be "And When I Die," I thought, well, that ought to bring him in droves. But you came anyway. You know, it's interesting being a hospice chaplain. On one hand, people treat us like rock stars. I've never had such appreciation and admiration. People go, "Oh, you guys are incredible, and thank you so much for what you do." And but how do you do it? You know, and then there's a little bit of the question, and it sort of puts people off and maybe even frightens them a little bit, and they wonder, how can I get up and go to work every day and minister to the sick and the dying and the grieving? And then every now and then it gets just really a little bit bizarre. Our triage nurse called me one day, and this sort of fits into what Mark sent out to you in the email. My triage nurse called me one day and said, "Dan, you're the king." I said, "I'm the king? The king of what?" She says, "Well, you're attending more deaths than anybody." I went, "I'm not sure I want to be the king of that. You know, I'd like to be the king of church growth. I'd like to be the home run king. I'd like to make more money than anybody. I'm not sure I even want to be that king." But anyway, I was number one and was kind of proud to be number one, so I called my parents, who were elderly and not doing too well in Pennsylvania, and I said, "Dad, Mom, guess what? I'm number one. I'm the king. I attend more deaths than anybody." They said, "Don't come and see us." Mark and I were having a conversation, and I was telling him about my hospice experiences, and I told him about my three main lessons. He says, "Would you come and share that with our people? Especially as it relates to the Psalms of Lament, perhaps Psalm 22. I'm going to share with you my three main lessons I've learned in my years as a hospice chaplain. It may touch close to some of you who are sore, aching and hurting from grief." Danny, thank you for that song. It's awesome. But I hope it also brings comfort and hope and a sense of what we need to do as Americans who live in a death-denying culture. And maybe you're like me, you're even afraid of grief, and you sweep it under the rug and you don't know how to deal with it. And so we live with a heavy burden. I met a friend, I made a friend at Starbucks over here in Bellevue one day. I was sitting at the long table there with my coffee, and he came and sat on the other side. We made a quick introduction, and he said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a hospice chaplain." And "Oh, well, that's interesting." We talked for just 1 or 2 minutes. And I said to him, "You know, it's just considering that this is the most common experience of the human, is to experience grief." I said, "You look around this coffee shop, as professional and successful and put together as this crowd looks, I'm sure somebody in this coffee shop this morning is in grief." And as I said that to him, he started to cry. And a tear ran down his cheek and dripped onto his laptop. And he said, 2 weeks ago, I lost my best friend." So I don't know who I'm talking to here today, but I know some of you are in acute grief. I know some of you have grief that maybe you've never dealt with. I know all of us are facing this subject of death in one way or another. Maybe we hear it on television when there's a shooting at an elementary school or a theater, or when there's a horrible tornado in Oklahoma or a wildfire just down the road. But we're faced with this subject. How do we as Christians really take an intelligent and meaningful, emotionally healthy, spiritual approach to this subject? I'm just going to tell you what I saw. I hope you find it helpful. The first lesson I learned, and as this relates to Psalm 22, I'm not going to go down Psalm 22 verse by verse. Do you remember those things we used to do in school where on the left side were the answers and on the right side were the questions, or vice versa, and you drew the line and you connected it across? We're sort of going to do that this morning. The first lesson I learned in hospice that really struck out to me is the importance of every life. And if you want to look at verse 30, it touches on the importance of your life. That your life matters, and it matters to future generations. Now, it's hard to understand how much our life matters, but when you're a hospice chaplain that stands at the bedside of so many people who have passed, and you watch the way the family around them reacts, you start to realize, it's really true. Every life really does matter. Every single life is important. This place is different today because you're here. And you may sit there and go, oh no, if I left and if I went somewhere, it wouldn't make any bit of difference. It'd be the same service. No, you will smile at somebody. You will shake a hand. You will say a word. You will have a cup of coffee. You will sing praises, and somebody will notice you, and you will make a difference by being here. Every life is enormously important. But it's a struggle to believe that. I've recently published a book. It's called Welcome to the Big Leagues, Every Man's Journey to Significance. I wrote a book on a baseball player that didn't think he mattered because he was a utility player among superstars. And as I was getting to know Darrell, I recognized I was the same thing. I was a church planter. I was doing small things in the Lord's work. And he was a utility player among superstars in the Cincinnati Reds when they were called the Big Red Machine. And I was pastoring small churches. And he didn't feel like he was important, and I didn't feel like I was important. And a few things happened in his life where he began to realize that his position mattered. And he was important. And I began to realize that God was saying to me that my life mattered. But at the same time I was writing this book, I was working at hospice. And I started to see over and over again how much one person mattered to another and the impact of one life on another. If I can just share with you a couple of stories. This is where just the lights started going on for me. I would be sitting with the family after a loved one had passed, and I would tell the family, I didn't know your loved one. I'm sorry. Could you tell me something about them that will help me know a little something about them? And here's some of the things people would share. One time they said, I remember the way my mom sang when she fixed pancakes. I remember another time, a large living room full of people, and I said, tell me something about this guy. And they all kind of started to laugh. They said, one time we were camping, and he came out of a cornfield and scared us all to death. And they all laughed, and the warm memories of his humor. Humor is an amazing thing that people bring up at times like this. But the one that really struck me the most of all was a night I was in a home. I'm pretty sure it was a Mexican family, and very large family, many, many people there. And this very, very old lady in her late 90s had just passed. Again, house just full of people. And children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, in-laws, cousins, friends, family. And here was a little old lady that hadn't done anything seemingly significant in years and years and years, who had just passed. I watched her grandson stand at the foot of her bed. And this is a grandson that I would not have wanted to meet in a dark alley. He was a grandson that would not have been the guy I would have hung out with on my day off. He stood there with his cap crooked, tattoos, baggy pants. I had a feeling he might have been a pretty tough dude. But he cried like a baby. His chin puckered, his lip pouted, tears streamed down his cheeks as he wept at the bed of his grandmother. And I thought, this lady mattered. Her life was important. She might not have known. She probably didn't. But her life really mattered. It mattered to this boy. And somehow, as he was living his life, maybe in a drug world, maybe in a gang world, his grandmother was still a reference point for how life was supposed to be lived and that he mattered. Maybe you're an older person that doesn't feel like you're doing anything important anymore. I want to tell you something. Your life matters until the day you die, and then even past that, because future generations will be influenced by your life. This isn't just positive thinking. There's theology for this. As I was writing the book and as I was processing these experiences in my mind, I began to notice this string of verses in Scripture that point out how much everybody's life matters. Do you know before the world was created, God knew your name? Ephesians chapter 1. When you were being knit together in your mother's womb, Psalm 139, it was with a design. When God breathed the breath of life into you so that you would be alive, it was so that you would be alive at this time in history and so that you would be able to exist and live your life in a way that made a difference. Then the Lord gave you talents and gifts and experiences and invited you into His purpose. And if that isn't enough, He promised you a place in heaven, and He even said, I'm preparing a place there, and I'm going to come back and take you there and give it to you. Everybody's life matters. And when you're a hospice chaplain, and when you stand at the death of a loved one, you realize life's never going to be the same again because this person mattered. The second lesson for me in hospice was that every death is sacred. There's a sacredness to each death. In verse 19, the person dying here in Psalm 22 is Jesus. It's a prophetic, messianic psalm. It's also a psalm of David, and it's also a place where we can identify with Christ in His death and where He identifies with us in our death. But he says, do not be far from me. I want to tell you, when we are going through the valley of the shadow of death, He is not far away. He is near, He is close, and that is a sacred time. At Hospice of St. John, we do something that other hospices don't do. We have a chaplain attend every death. And that's why I got to attend so many deaths over the last 3.5 years. When there would be a death in the wee hours of the morning, I would get the call and I would go and be with the family. I would get to be in all kinds of settings. I would be with poor people. I would be with middle-class people. I would be with rich people. I'd be with people that died a little younger, people that died a little older. All kinds of scenarios. With hospice, they all were deaths that were expected. That's one common denominator. But as I would be there at every death, I would start to see some things happen too often to be a coincidence. It wasn't just the emotion of the death and the thought that someone is leaving us forever, but there was the thought that maybe God was present here. Maybe where they have left and where they have gone is real, and people would think about things in a different way, and it was a sacred and special and spiritual time. And for me as a Christian and as a believer going into these settings, I was so honored to be able to share with them some scriptures. And I would never share, and one of the things about hospice in a clinical setting, you can only share when people want you to. And so I would ask permission. Would you like me to share a scripture? Would you like me to say a prayer? And over and over and over again, probably 90% of the time they'd say, yes, would you? Would you please share with us? And so these are the scriptures that I often shared. We're in Psalm 22 today, but if you just go over one chapter, Psalm 23 is a precious psalm. And then it says, even though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. And a few verses later it says, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I would share that with people over and over again, and I'd connect it with John 14, 1 through 4, where Jesus said, let not your heart be troubled. If you believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I wouldn't have told you. But I go there to prepare a place for you, and if I go, I'll come again and I will take you there to be with me, so that where I am, you will be also. And I'd share with these families, there's a couple of common denominators in these scriptures. One, He helps us get from here to there. He promises to be with us in both of those scriptures. Now, is that sacred or what? To think that Jesus Himself does not delegate that job, but He comes to take us. And He takes us to a real place, a place called a house, a home. So when we say we're going home, we're going home. We're going home where thieves do not steal and moths and rust do not corrupt, a place that's perfect. And it's such a sacred place. And then I would have experiences that would only confirm that. After years of attending these deaths, my faith increased, it didn't decrease. I didn't become cynical or doubtful, I became hopeful. And I believed in what I was seeing. I can just share with you a couple of experiences. I got a call one night and I went to visit this family, and there were 3 daughters sitting around where their mother had just passed. And I walked in and introduced myself as the chaplain and asked how everybody was doing. And these girls were all kind of nervous and excited. And they said, Mom was a devout believer. She was very religious and very full of faith, and we really weren't. We really didn't follow her. We didn't do what she wanted us to do. But something happened. She saw something, because her eyes got wide open, her mouth open, and she was ready to go meet what we couldn't see. And then she slipped away, and he said, we believe now. It was a sacred experience. Another one, and this may be the most profound one I ever encountered, one night at our inpatient facility. And unfortunately, that inpatient facility, if you read yesterday's newspaper, we're closing it due to some budget cuts. But I believe it's a sacred place because Jesus visited there many times. I got a call one night about supper time that we had just had a death, and so I drove from my house in Castle Rock to our facility in Lakewood, and I went in and I checked in with the nurses, and I asked them what was going on, and they said, something unusual is going on in that room, and we don't know if it's real, and we don't quite know what it is, but we just want you to know. And so I went in, and I knocked, and I opened the door, and I went in and introduced myself. I'm Chaplain Dan, and this wife is just bouncing off the walls. And she was young, probably in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. And K-Love was playing loud on the radio. And she said, I heard them. I heard them. I heard the angels. They were here that came to take him to heaven. And she said, we had a horrible, horrible life. I had affairs. He had affairs. We had drug problems. He was addicted. He went into Teen Challenge and met Christ. Changed his life, changed our lives. And then he got cancer. And now I've lost him. But I know where he is. I know where he is. And so I stood there and celebrated that with her for a few minutes, and I walked back to the nurse's station, and they said, Well, do you think that was real? I said, do I think that was real? You don't make that kind of stuff up. Certainly I believe that was real. Now, it isn't all like that. There aren't all those kind of experiences. And you know that. But some things happen too often to be a coincidence. And I would see so many times when people had a real sense of where they were going and had a real sense of God's presence. And I would even be there at that very dramatic time when a person passed. And I'd go, this is sacred. It wouldn't always be easy. It'd so often be filled with tears and sadness and weeping. But it was a special and it was a sacred time. Every life is important. Every death is sacred. And the Lord attends every one. And then the last point is the magnitude of everyone's grief. Our good friends Jim and Glenna are part of your work here, and we went through a situation in the church I planted in Castle Rock where a loved one of ours, the first convert in our new church, went into the hospital for knee surgery and through a blood clot and died. We were devastated. And I was planting a new church and pastoring, and I could preach a decent funeral sermon. I could do good bedside manner in a hospital visit, hospital setting. I did not know how to lead a church through grief. I was one of those grief-denying, let's get through it, let's get on with it, let's live life, she's in heaven. We would say things to comfort ourselves like, she had this amazing gift of hospitality. We'd say, Jeanette is preparing the Last Supper of the Lamb. She's going to be ready so that when we get there, she's going to be there to greet us. She's in a better place. We'd say all these things to make ourselves feel better. But they didn't work because we weren't in a better place. Our lives were worse because of where Jeanette was. She wasn't with us. And we didn't know how to deal with that grief, and I didn't know how to lead a church through grief. At hospice, I began to learn more of the importance and the power of grief and a healthier way to deal with it. If this circle in my hand represents your life, and this circle represents the life of your loved one, you overlap as you live. Sometimes like the Olympic rings, and sometimes almost completely like an eclipse. And when you lose that person, when they die, that piece of you is missing. And life is never going to be the same again. We in America have trouble with that. I watched a ceremony for the shooting at the elementary school in New England. And it was the first anniversary, and they were going to have 26 seconds of silence. 1 second for each child. And I thought, 1 second of silence per life, that doesn't get us through grief. That's not grief work. That's token. And I watched a man standing on the platform who was awkward even during the 26 seconds. I'm challenged in what I didn't know with Jeanette. I know now how we have to deal with grief in not being afraid of it, but by diving into it and by living in it and letting it work in our lives, because it's there that we find healing. As this psalm starts, it starts with an odd scenario. My God, why have you forsaken me? We know these were the words of Jesus on the cross. We know there are times when life doesn't make sense. And as we go through this psalm, we see, I believe in you. I'm even calling you my God, but I don't see you there. I don't feel you there. You're not helping me. How could you let this happen? This is all wrong. This doesn't make sense. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? Why are you so far from saving me? I want to share with you a story. I'm going to use these two chairs. This is not a grief story, but it illustrates what we go through in grief many times. I was making a hospice call to a death in one of the nice nursing homes around here in the wee hours of the morning. And as we do at Hospice of St. John, the chaplain is there, and the chaplain stays until the mortuary arrives, and we escort the person into the care of the mortuary. This family had come, had visited, had paid their respects, and had left, and so I remained. So I went out and I sat down in the lobby of this memory care unit, and I'm just waiting and passing time. And as I'm sitting there in the chair, all at once, this face appears just about this close. And it was a really cute little old lady wearing a yellow house coat and slippers that looked at me with the most quizzical look, like, who are you and why are you here? It was the memory care unit, and she had Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, and I didn't fit into her scenario, and she had lost track of time, because that's often the case with people suffering with that. And so I'm looking at her, and I smiled at her, and then I decided to do something, and I need to tell you why. I would always want to be respectful of anyone, but at that very time, my mother, for the first time, had also become demented. Probably having strokes, she became demented a week before my father died. And so my mom had to be put in a nursing home back in Pennsylvania. And I thought, I wish I could be with my mom. I hope people are treating her well. I want to treat this lady the way I hope somebody's treating my mother. So I looked at her, and I smiled, and I said, would you like to sit down? And so she did. So she sat down, and we looked at each other, and I smiled, and we couldn't communicate because she couldn't talk, and she couldn't say words that made any sense. But I thought, her life matters. She's one of God's children, and maybe that's like my mom. So I'm going to try to figure out what she's thinking. And I just smiled at her, and I'd try to guess what she was saying, and she'd try to say things, and we went back and forth and back and forth. And this maybe went on for 15 or so minutes. I don't really know. But about the 15-minute point, something dramatic happened. Her countenance changed. All at once, just like somebody slapped her in the face, she kind of straightened up, and she grinned from ear to ear. She was just happy down to her toes. And I got this wonderful, warm feeling in my heart. And I thought, I don't know what happened, but we just connected. We connected without words. We connected without even anything that technically made sense. But something made sense on a much, much deeper level. I'll never forget it. When I finished my calls at 3 and 4 in the morning, I was always eager to go home and go to bed. This night, I was so pumped up and stimulated that I couldn't sleep. And so I had to just think about what I had experienced. And then it sort of occurred to me, as it comes to my relationship with God, so often the chairs are switched. And I'm the demented one. I'm the one that doesn't even know what to say. And so I cry out, my God, why are you letting it go this way? Why isn't it working better? I don't, and it's clunky and confusing and emotional and sad. You know what? It's like grief too. And here's where we need to get it. I know this isn't a happy motivational sermon, but I think it's an important message for all of us that if we realize we don't have to be afraid of the grief that we feel, because when we cry out to a God and we say, God, why are you forsaking me? Why did I lose this loved one? Why did I lose my wife? Why did I lose my mom, my dad, my child? Why did this shooting happen? Why did this tornado happen? Why did this accident happen? Lord, there's no answer. Why did I lose my job? Why did we lose our home? Why did I go bankrupt? Lord, I am in grief. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. If you go there, do you know what you will find? He's looking at you. He's there. He's there for you at that moment. And you will experience Him in a deeper and more intimate and powerful way than you can imagine. Maybe more powerfully than you've ever experienced Him before in your life. I've come to the point where I think, you know, we can't be a saint until we admit we're a sinner. I don't think we can know how to live until we know how to die. And I'm not sure we can experience the beauty of joy until we have the courage to go into the depths of grief. Because when we go there, this is not a morose thing for melancholy and dark people. This is a common experience that we will all face. And when we're willing to go there, we will find God there, who weeps with us, who loves us, who cares for us, who comforts us, who helps us experience Him, and who helps us live. And a God who cares, and a God who will get us through, and a God who will help us face anything. And that's the God that comes through to us in Psalm 22, which is why Psalm 22, that deep, dark psalm of lament, has to be sung by the best musicians, the best singers, because it's a special psalm right there in the middle of the Bible. And this is a special experience right in the middle of your lives.